Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway, and we're joined by our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. And Frank, today we're talking about the continued row between President Trump and NATO, and specifically what some are calling this naughty and nice list of good and bad allies. Who is on it and why?
Well, he pretty much dislikes the whole of Europe. He's very upset with NATO's European members for failing, in his words, or in his view, to join in with the US-Israel attack on Iran that began on February the 28th. NATO members are a bit perplexed by this because it's a defensive alliance. Its focus is very much on trying to protect Europe from Russia's advances in the east, in Ukraine, and trying to support Ukraine. But nevertheless, he is upset about this, and this has trickled down into the so-called Department of War, i.e. the Pentagon, the US military, and they, in this leaked email, they appear to be looking at proposals for punishing those European nations. Specifically, Spain is mentioned, and the UK. Spain, where there are 2 US bases, refused the use of those bases to the US during its assault on Iran. And the Pentagon said, look, an official has said an absolute baseline for us, a bare minimum of what we expect from NATO allies is something called ABO. So that's access, basing, and overflight. And all of 3 of those were denied to the United States. So the US is talking about trying to suspend Spain from NATO, which it can't do, by the way. It's not in NATO's charter. But of course, there are other things that the US could do to retaliate. And on the UK, the Pentagon email talks about reviewing US support for Britain over the ownership of the Falkland Islands, which Argentina refers to as las Islas Malvinas, the Malvina Islands. They are claimed by Argentina, governed by Britain, and the British Prime Minister's office has said sovereignty is not up for discussion on this. It's all about the right of the people who live there to choose who they want to belong to. And the last census showed 99% plus wanted to stay British.
You mentioned the alternative punishments if, for example, the US can't suspend Spain from NATO. What might those punishments be? And what about the rewards for those countries' model allies, as the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth calls them, who step up?
Well, let's just start with what the email doesn't say. And there is no more talk in it, mercifully, for NATO of the US pulling out. We already know that the US considers that it's been paying far too high a burden financially for Europe's defense, which it has. I mean, President Trump is absolutely right on that. So what could they do? Well, they could draw down some of the personnel they've got stationed in Europe, which would be a real worry to Europe. I mean, US is by far and away the biggest, most important partner in the NATO alliance, by far. It outnumbers everybody by a huge amount, and of course, it's a nuclear state. So if it were to withdraw that support while still saying it's in NATO, it could do that, but I think it would probably need congressional approval, and I'm not sure he would get it. He'd certainly need congressional approval, 2/3 majority, to withdraw the US from NATO. But President Trump is somebody who, as we know, doesn't play by normal rules. He's an upsetter. He likes to tip up the chessboard. So who knows what he would do in terms of rewarding those countries? Financial things, tariffs or lack of, economically, support for parties. Remember that the US has interfered quite substantially in the last 12 months or so to support parties and political movements that are in many cases absolutely contrary to the democratically elected government in power. And that's placed further strain on Europe's relationships with Washington.
Now, there's one quote from an official who says they want to decrease the sense of entitlement among these European nations. Do they have a point? I mean, you suggested that some European nations aren't spending enough, but are there more things than that?
Well, I think, and I'll say it again, I think Donald Trump is absolutely right when he says that Europe has been kind of freeloading off the US for a long time when it comes to defense expenditure. I mean, Poland and Romania are pretty much frontline states, and Poland is massively boosting its military. It's going to have one of the strongest and best equipped armies in Europe. They spend a far higher percentage of their GDP, close to 4%, than most other NATO countries. Britain is still sort of struggling to get from 2.3 to 2.5, while countries like Estonia, which are right up next to Russia, are spending close to 5%. There was a thing called the peace dividend. So when the Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, governments in the West saying, great, we don't really have to worry about Russia anymore. Let's spend all the money that, or lots of the money that we were spending on all these guns and weapons and defense and tanks and stuff. Let's spend it instead on the stuff that people need, schools and hospitals and roads and welfare. And that was perfectly justified for many, many years. The problem is that the peace dividend has gone on for far longer than most people say it should. Now, some would disagree, I know, but the fact is that Russia is positioning itself in many ways for the day when, God forbid, there could be a war between Russia and the West. And there simply isn't enough money in the kitty. There hasn't been for some time. Of course, America spends an absolutely vast, practically $1 trillion a year on their defense budget. I mean, it's something like 900 billion US. It's huge. And they consider that NATO is what Donald Trump calls a paper tiger, that it's all talk and it doesn't really have the muscle to back it. And that if the US were to pull out, which it hasn't done yet, but if it were to refuse to take part in a NATO operation to defend its borders, say, that Europe would be pretty weak and defenseless.
Now, President Trump has taken a dim view of NATO for many years, but does the US get anything out of it?
Yes, of course it does. There's something called Article 5, which is in NATO's charter, and it's probably the most important article in the NATO charter, and that is that it considers an attack on one country is an attack on all, and the attacked country has the right to call on NATO, all the other members, to come to its defense. Now, that article has only been triggered once, and that was after the 9/11 attacks on September the 11th, 2001. Who triggered it? The United States. And what that meant was that the US went to war in Afghanistan to kick out the Taliban, which they did for 20 years, supported by Britain and followed by a huge number of NATO countries. So you had countries like Romania, Estonia, Canada, Denmark, all deploying troops in support of that US operation, thousands of miles away from themselves. They didn't need to do it, but they did it to support the United States. So it is utterly insulting to those countries that lost troops to imply, as Donald Trump did a few weeks or months ago, that it was only really US troops that did the fighting. They did the fighting as well, and they paid a price for it. And he is totally ungrateful for that. So there's a lot of bad blood, frankly, between the White House and a lot of these NATO countries because they feel underappreciated, and that his remarks are insulting to them.
This latest row leaves NATO in a difficult position. What does it mean for the organisation in the long term, particularly with regards to Russia and China?
Well, it's yet a further reminder that Europe is going to have to do more to look after its own defense. And this isn't just about shoring up borders or spending more money. It's about having a long, hard look at whether Europe has got the industrial capacity to sustain a conflict. Britain, for example, has sent a huge amount of its arsenal to Ukraine. They don't have any more AS-90 self-propelled guns anymore. They've all gone to Ukraine. They're having to import Swedish Archer systems, artillery systems. Britain's army it would struggle to produce a division, even a brigade, frankly, some generals have said, in combat, and certainly would not be able to last much beyond about a week. So it's about your sustainability just as much as the punch that you can deliver on day one. And the really scary thing about this is that because Europe has run down its conventional armies so much, and it doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons in size. There are a few US gravity bombs that are stationed in the Netherlands, in Turkey. But the US is an unreliable partner, so it's by no means certain that the US would come in and use those. What it means is on something called the escalatory ladder. That's the sort of how you jump up the ladder. Right, well, if you're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then we're going to retaliate with this. The escalatory ladder lacks the middle rungs for most European nations, including the UK and France. They don't have the tactical nuclear warheads, ones that you would use on the battlefield or in short range or medium range missiles that Russia has. So Russia could escalate that, and Europe's only response would be to either capitulate or to escalate further and say, you stop it right now or we go strategic nuclear. That's where you talk about flattening cities. That's the stuff that floats around under, in submarine silos under the Atlantic that are end of days. So it's a very worrying situation.
Frank, thank you. Frank Gardner, our security correspondent. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click on the link below. Thanks for watching.